month of August is found in Hebrews 10, verses 23 through 25. Let us hold tightly, without wavering, to the hope we affirm, for God can be trusted to keep his promise. Let us think of ways to motivate one another to acts of love and good works. And let us not neglect our meeting together, as some people do, but encourage one another, especially now that the day of his return is drawing near. We've looked at several of these let us moments in this particular text. We talked about let us hold on tight to the promises that God has given to us. We talked about let us motivate one another. How do we keep motivating one another to love and to do good works? And tonight we want to consider this part of this text. Let us not neglect our meeting together as some people do. Let us not neglect our meeting together as some people do. This is the only verse that has a let us not. Why not just say let us meet regularly together? That might make more sense. Well, let us not is aimed at the word neglect. It has the meaning here of deserting or leaving stranded, or giving up, or abandoning. It was a separating of oneself from the local Christian community. And why was that happening? Well, in this context, and we've talked about this before, it was the dread of persecution. The dread of persecution. Somehow I can understand that basis for neglecting the gathering, or as some translations say, forsaking the gathering. It's plain fear. It's plain fear. What if those who are persecuting us show up? What if tonight, maybe last week, people came here and took some of us away and persecuted us? How would you feel about coming this week? You might think twice. You might think, I don't know if I want to go this week. What if the people come again and I'm involved and I get taken out and they beat me up and I lose everything? We already mentioned the people in Pakistan who have run away from their homes and hide out in sugarcane because people are persecuting them and destroying their homes. Can you imagine how they feel? As I was thinking about all of this, though, I also read something in Open Doors this week. Got this magazine, maybe some of you did too. And it shows the flip side of those who are being persecuted. The flip side of those who are being persecuted is being more on spot, giving their testimony for Jesus. Two examples of women. One who had been put in a hospital, and they figured she was going to die of cancer, and the Lord healed her, raised her up, and what does she do? She gives testimony to Jesus in an area where it's dangerous to give testimony to Jesus. And another woman who was really quite distressfully injured, beaten, legs broken, and other such things for her faith, was able to escape eventually, and outside the area where she was living, she was able to minister to people and to give testimony about the Lord. I find that amazing. I don't know what I would do. Do you know what you would do? Probably not. None of us do. One thing I think we can say is that there are places where people could have every reason to want to not follow Jesus, but they do anyway. I was reading in another magazine about the preaching going on in the places where the war is going on in the Ukraine. And what do we see happening? Pastors continue to preach in a place not far from Bakhmut, where the terrible war took place in the Ukraine, in Bakhmut, and he's preaching, and people are coming to know the Lord in the midst of turmoil. It's not without reason that Tertullian, one of the early church fathers, said, the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the faith. Why? When people really have to give up their lives for the faith, they become much more determined to speak for Jesus. And people are much more willing to believe that they have faith. Somehow, I wonder if the writer didn't know here that the people in this time frame, when they were being threatened, needed to hear, don't neglect our meeting together. Although we don't face this kind of persecution, I don't know if we face any persecution. Do you face any persecution? Maybe occasional laughter. Oh, you're a Christian. Ha, ha, ha. Well, that doesn't hurt too much. But some of them were tempted to neglect meeting. And we are sometimes tempted to neglect meeting together. But the question is why? What is our reason for neglect? Perhaps our context is the very opposite of these early Christians, at least here in this part of the world. We face no perceivable persecution. But does that mean that we have lost the value of our meeting together? Would we value our meeting together more if we had to risk something to go to church? To meet with the other believers? In a way, it costs us nothing to come to church. I don't even check who's paying the tithe. Maybe that would be one kind of cost. But that isn't really a cost. That's actually a luxury to give. And we forgot to take the offering tonight, even as I say this. So that shows you how much I worry about that, doesn't it? However, we don't have any risk. If we go to the meeting or not go to the meeting, if I come to church or not come to church, if I worship or not worship, does it matter? Does it make any difference if I do this or not do this? The writer in this text would say, yes, it does matter. Some thoughts. If you were a new Christian who just became a follower of Jesus, how would you know how to develop your walk with Jesus without meeting with other Christians? Jesus himself told the parable about a farmer, remember, when he scattered seed. And in the scattering of seeds, he said some seeds fell on shallow soil and sprang up quickly, but when the sun came out, these plants had no depth, no rootedness, and what happened? They got scorched in the sun and withered and died away. How do you get deeply rooted? The author was aware of Jesus' words. How could you motivate these believers not to neglect this life-giving place, their regular gathering of Christians? It was life-giving. They needed spiritual nourishment. The question is, where do you get your spiritual nourishment? The mutual sharing, the author knew, would strengthen them for whatever lied ahead. Not all the Christians in the early church were persecuted. So they didn't know who would be persecuted and who wouldn't be persecuted. And you know, life is always an unknown factor for all of us. Our conditions are different, but it is still crucial for our faith development to gather regularly. Because when otherwise do you take a concentrated hour, 1 hour in each week to worship God and fellowship with other Christians and pray together? Where else do you do this? I would suggest probably the most of us would not have any other moment in the week. You may have bits and pieces yourself, which is rightfully so, but meeting for the collective nature of nurturing our faith, neglecting this or simply staying away is dangerous to your development as a believer. How will your roots go down deeply? In Acts 2:42 and 46, the early believers are described as devoting themselves to fellowship, worshiping together at the temple each day, meeting in homes for the Lord's Supper, and sharing their meals with great joy and generosity. It was a given, a part of their lifestyle that they regularly meet together. It would be an interesting question to say, what is your lifestyle as a believer? What's your lifestyle like? Families, what is your lifestyle? How will your kids get to know the Lord? What's your lifestyle? It was a given that these early Christians met. Without enough Christian fellowship, meeting together, our souls wither. Or another way around, the fire goes out. Who puts a log on your heart and helps it to burn for Jesus? The writer here in this letter does not want that to happen to these new believers who are under pressure. He says staying away is not the answer. Meeting together was the way forward. And I looked in the faith chapter, as we have done the last couple of weeks, to see what story could help underline this part of the text. And there is a long description of someone in the faith chapter, and that is the person of Moses. Moses is the one described in the lengthiest part of this text in chapter 11. And perhaps the key is found in Hebrews 11:28. It was by faith that Moses had commanded the people of Israel to keep the Passover and to sprinkle blood on the doorposts so that the angel of death would not kill their firstborn sons. The word command is used here. Let us not neglect this communal moment. Moses had a long history of commitment to these slaves in Egypt. He was committed to building a community. That is never simple. As a pastor always knows, building community is tough. Why? Because everybody's free to do what they want. No one is obligated to come to community. No one. So what draws us? It has to be something bigger than ourselves. And Moses was trying to help these slaves to understand that they could become members of a committed community. The writer says in 11:25 and 26, he brings that word suffering, which those Christians in Hebrews could understand. Moses chose to share the oppression of God's people instead of enjoying fleeting pleasures of sin. He thought it was better to suffer for the sake of Christ than to own treasure in Egypt, for he was looking ahead to his great reward. Did you catch the tone here? It's better to suffer now and be rewarded later. How many of us really believe that? I don't know. I think we like to be rewarded now and be suffering later. We like to flip it. I'll get my rewards now, and then later on, Lord, you can take some of it away. What if it's reversed? If you look at Moses' work with these suffering slaves, he challenged the Pharaoh and put his life on the line to let Pharaoh let his people go. And if you read those exciting stories, the drama is worth considering. 10 plagues were there to somehow soften Pharaoh's hard heart. I was thinking about these plagues in the light of our current environment. Could you say that some of the fires we have now are plagues? Are some of the hailstones that have been falling from the sky in certain places part of the plagues that God is maybe using to speak to people in this world? I'm not saying that God is sending these things, by the way. I don't think God wants anyone to suffer from fire and flood. I really don't. But can they be a wake-up call for people to consider their lives, to consider what is going on in this world, and decide to turn to God who really cares for them? Pharaoh's heart was hard. Even in the last plague, when Moses told him what was going to happen, that all the eldest sons would be killed in the plague, he didn't change. Moses was told by God, Pharaoh won't listen to you. You know, I used to be amazed by Pharaoh. I mean, after these 9 plagues, didn't he get smart? Wasn't he going to smarten up? Good old Pharaoh. I used to think, how could it be that he was so dumb? But I'm not like that anymore. We have leaders in our world today who are ruthless with their own people, like Pharaoh was to his own people, and they don't care if a bunch of them die. Wicked hearts become stone, and we see stone-like hearts everywhere in our world today. It's not some other time, it's now. They resist any possibility of goodness. But for us this evening, the fact is that in all of these serious drama, Moses gave God's instructions to the people, everyone in the community, as to how they were to react during the last plague. This was a decisive moment when Pharaoh would be so agitated because all of his people said, "What are you going to do?" that he would say, "Get out, Moses, go, leave." But it was after the plague. I thought that's interesting. It wasn't before. Moses commands his people to take care of the first Passover meal. And that became an ongoing communal celebration. It was to go on to the next generations. If you read about that, it says, the annual festival will be a visible sign for you. And in the future, your children will ask you, what does all of this mean? Then you will tell them, with the power of his mighty hand, the Lord brought us out of Egypt, the place of slavery. When the Hebrew Christians were reminded of that pivotal story in the spiritual development of the Jewish people, they could see what the Hebrew writer had already said in chapter 10, that Moses was only a shadow of things to come. And that it was God's will for us to be made holy by the sacrifice of the body of Jesus Christ once for all time. What a powerful reminder of the importance of community. The Passover then and the celebration of communion in the community now has received, of course, a fresh meaning in the Lord's Supper. And this supper is always shared in community. Neglecting to meet meant not being fed. For the early Christians, the meeting was for the meal. Broken bread and poured out wine, a shared meal of love often preceded the Lord's Supper. They ate together. I mean, I've heard some of us say, yeah, people come more when we eat together. That's right. More people come when we eat together than when we don't eat together. Why? Because eating is a central thing about community. And then when you follow the love meal up with the love feast, what a combination. Meeting together in community enables the sharing of the word, read and heard and explained, the hearing of prayers and praying oneself, and the eating of the supper Jesus prepared for his followers. All of this nurtures our souls, our very lives. Not coming to meet removes the moment of shared grace. Means of grace flow out of our meeting together. Can we wonder why our faith is weak if we abandon the means of grace? Our gatherings in all their forms are not optional to our faith. Like we can pick out items on a menu. You know, if you've ever gone out to eat, you have a menu, you can pick and choose. Or if you have a smorgasbord, you can go and just pick what you want. Is that how it is in the Christian faith? You just pick what you want? I would say we have to be more reflective on what is crucial to our overall development in the faith. So we are meeting for the meal. Let's not neglect our meeting together. And all the people said, Amen. Amen.